Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Multicultural press conference. My name is Dr. Marianne Gale, and I'm the Director of Population and Community Health in Southeastern Sydney Local Health District. I'm a different face from what you normally see, and I'm here filling in for Jess Halaratne, who's your usual host. And Jess is having a very well-deserved holiday at the moment. So I'll be your host for today's press conference. Before we go further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on from the various locations that we're joining today. I'm here joining you from Camaragal land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. At today's press conference, we're going to talk about the theme this month of multicultural mental health. Many of you may be aware that this month is Mental Health Month, and that's why we have a focused session today on mental health, such an important issue for our community. And for this discussion today, we have two special guests. We firstly have the Honourable Rose Jackson, Minister for Mental Health, and we also have the Acting Chief Psychiatrist with us here, Dr. Michael Bowden. So welcome very much, Minister, and Michael, thank you very much for being here. Just wanted to note that today's session, as they always are, will be recorded and made available online for those of you who want to listen to it all again or share it with colleagues or friends. And as we go on, we're also going to post a number of resources in the chat that we're going to talk about a little bit today as well in the session. And I do encourage everyone to have a look in the chat for the links to those resources. And please do look through them. There's some really valuable information contained in there. All right, so I think that's enough from me, and we're going to get stuck into some questions. And Minister Jackson, I'm going to turn to you first for the first question. So as I've mentioned, this month of October is Mental Health Month, and the theme for this year is that we all have a role to play. So could you tell us a little bit about mental health in New South Wales, paint the picture for us about what the status of the situation is at the moment, and what are the kinds of roles that we can all play?
Yeah, great. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. My name's Rose. I'm the Minister for Mental Health. And look, what a great opportunity in Mental Health Month to have this incredibly important conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us. Look, the reality is it's been a really tough time in New South Wales when it comes to mental health and wellbeing. We've had natural disasters, bushfires, floods. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been a range of really significant stresses that people in the community have faced. And compounding all of that, of course, recently, the cost of living challenges, people, really struggling with increased interest rates and, prices going up, rent going up, bills going up. There's no denying that if we're starting a conversation about mental health in New South Wales, that we have to start with an acknowledgement that it has been a tough time. 1 in 5 people in our community are experiencing some form of mental ill health. And I think all of us know in our own personal lives, whether it's us or someone we know and care about, a loved one, we can all think about someone who has experienced some challenges in recent times. So we know that it's a profound and widespread issue that's really acknowledged by the New South Wales government. But it's not just about acknowledging those struggles and that it's been a tough time. The theme of this year's Mental Health Month, which is we all have a role to play, is actually a really positive one. And it's positive because it gives us agency and power as individuals to do something about it. We do need to acknowledge that it's been tough. We do need to acknowledge that people in the community have been struggling and that conversations about mental health are incredibly important at this time. But it's also important to acknowledge that each and every one of us can do something about that, whether it's talk up, speak up about our own struggles, reach out for help for resources that are there, or ensure that if someone else around us is struggling, that we're able to provide them access to support. And as has been mentioned, some of the resources that the New South Wales government makes available to multicultural communities in order to ensure that if someone puts their hand up for help, we're there to grab that hand. We all do have that role to play. This isn't something that any one of us can say, no, it's not my job, or, it's not on me. Collectively, we all have agency to do something about mental health and to make a difference. So I think it's a great opportunity to ensure that every single part of our community, including our incredibly important and valued multicultural communities, know about this conversation, are able to participate in it, and have access to resources that are dedicated and specific and culturally informed to ensure that those communities are able to access the kind of services that the government is providing.
Thanks so much, Minister Jackson. Now, Dr. Bowden, thinking of our multicultural communities, mental health can be hard to talk about. Sometimes people can struggle to access the right kind of mental health supports that they might need. What do you think might be some of the challenges that multicultural communities might experience in accessing the kind of mental health support that they need?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. It can be really tough for people, and there's any number of reasons why people might struggle to know where to go to access mental health care or what to expect when they get there. A lot of practical reasons. So, for example, if you struggle with language, that can be a real barrier to finding out where to go, but also being understood when you get there and understanding what is available to you when you go there. Many people from different cultures might not have a clear understanding about what kind of services are actually available within New South Wales to look after their mental health. And particularly, I think, if people are newly arrived to New South Wales or to Australia, it's such a different environment from where they've come from for many people that actually knowing where to go can be a real barrier for them. Then there are some other practical issues. If you're new in a country, you might have very few supports around you to actually enable you to take the time to go. So if you're struggling to get childcare, for example, or if you don't have good access to transport, that can be a real barrier too. I think too, coming from different cultures, there's sometimes a different understanding of how the health system actually works. It can be very different in different countries. And we can sometimes assume, I think, in Australia that this is the way that health services work. And that can be really hard for people who don't really understand that because they've come from somewhere different. I think then if we turn to thinking about some of the cultural aspects of seeking care, different people from different cultures have a different idea about what mental health and what mental illness are. And that in itself is a bit of a barrier to actually knowing when to seek help or where to go. And sometimes even knowing that the kind of difficulty that you or somebody in your family or a friend is struggling with is actually a mental health concern. Sometimes I think people prefer to seek help from family or friends rather than going to a professional. And I think it's quite important to recognise that professional services are available for people no matter where they're from and no matter what language they speak, and that's actually an appropriate way to get some assistance. Sometimes people like to go to their religious leaders as well, and that's a really important source of support and also of information as to where to get help. People from some backgrounds have had quite difficult histories, and particularly there may be problems for people who have been refugees, for example, or who have had difficulties with their own government in the country where they came from. And that can be quite frightening for people, I think, when they're seeking help in Australia if they've had difficult experiences elsewhere. And that can be quite hard for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Bowden. I think a lot of factors to consider there. Before we go on, I just want to remind people that we would love to have your questions as well. So as we're talking, please do feel free to pop some questions in the chat for us. We will do our best to answer your questions. So as we're talking, if issues come up for you or queries that you have, please do feel free to pop them there in the chat. Minister Jackson, I'd like to come to you now. Thinking about some of those barriers that Dr. Bowden outlined, are there services to support culturally and linguistically communities in the mental health space? And could you tell us a little bit about what is available?
Yeah, there absolutely are services, and thank you so much, Michael, for really clearly articulating what some of those barriers are. I think it's really important that we call out and name and are open and honest about some of the reasons why it can be difficult for us to ask for help. But the good news is that there are a range of support services that the government does provide. I mean, first and foremost, we provide a lot of our services with interpreters available. So those language barriers that have been articulated, we do provide interpreters, to ensure that people are able to access services in their language. We also provide translated resources, and I think some of those will be popped in the chat. You can go on the New South Wales Health website and access a range of our resources as translated resources, so that again everyone is able to access support and direction and resources in their language of choice, in the language that they're most comfortable with, because we want people in these difficult conversations not to be struggling with language. We want them to use language that they're most comfortable with. And so we provide interpreters and translated resources. We also have the Transcultural Mental Health Centre. And part of that is the Transcultural Mental Health line. And I see that the phone number for that line has been popped in the chat. So make sure that you grab that and write that down, because that phone line is a dedicated clinical service that provides our multicultural community in New South Wales with access to culturally safe and responsive support. As I said, we know that for some people, calling some of our generalist mental health lines, if they require English, can be even more difficult than it is to ordinarily make a phone call and talk about your mental health. So we have that Transcultural Mental Health line and that Transcultural Mental Health Centre as a dedicated resource. And in a way, on top of that phone line, on top of that centre, on top of all of the translated resources that we have online, we also have this service. And I just think it's fantastic that we have the Multicultural Health Communication Service. And so we set up dedicated forums like this with clinical leaders like Michael and representatives of government like myself to be here and be available and have these special dedicated conversations. So those are some of the things that we are doing to ensure that we acknowledge those particular barriers. We don't pretend that they don't exist, and then that we have a dedicated response that really is primarily driven by ensuring that people are able to talk about their mental health in a language and in a way and in a culturally sensitive response that is most comfortable for them.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Minister. Dr. Bowden, I'll come to you now. The Minister talked to us a little bit about the Transcultural Mental Health Centre. Could you tell us a little bit more about the services available from that centre for multicultural communities?
Sure. I think, just to kind of pick up on that point that the Minister was just making, it's incredibly complicated for anybody talking about their mental health and their emotions and how they're feeling about things, and let alone trying to do that in a different language from your mother tongue. And so it's actually incredibly important that people do have access to those kinds of services that the Minister was talking about. The Transcultural Mental Health Centre is a fantastic centre. They've been around for a long time. They've actually got a lot of mental health resources in many different community languages. And on top of that, they've got some great guides, which they call practical guides. And that's a whole series of guides in different languages again, which give you really straightforward, practical kind of tips about things like well-being and about good sleep and the other kind of aspects of life which have an impact on mental well-being. And as I say, that's available in a range of community languages, so really useful and very readily available too. In addition to that, they've got a carer support program. So if you have somebody in your family who has mental health problems, and you're caring for them, you can actually access some support from the Transcultural Mental Health Centre as well. And they actually run groups in specific languages, different languages for specific communities. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those resources online so that you can see what's available for you. The Transcultural Mental Health Line is another aspect of the service that the centre actually runs, and that's about connecting people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities to mental health care within their own area. And they can connect people with experienced clinicians who actually understand their culture and can speak their language, which again is an incredibly important aspect of care. So they provide things like emotional support, and also advice about how to improve your well-being. They can also help people to access mental health care locally and provide that kind of support to those who are caring for somebody with a mental health problem. So again, I'd encourage you to take a look at those resources which are in the chat line.
Great. Thanks very much, Dr. Bowden. Minister, we know that people who have come to Australia as refugees have had very often some very difficult experiences in life. Are there mental health services available that are specific for people who have had a refugee experience?
Yes, there are, and absolutely it is important to acknowledge that that community has particular needs, and that we want to be responsive to them. So we have the mental health community living supports for refugees program, and sure we'll be able to pop the details of that in the chat, but that is a particular program. It's community based, and I think that's really important. That community based care is often the best way for people to access services. So it's community-based care for refugees and asylum seekers. And it doesn't require a formal mental health diagnosis. Anyone can access it. It's incredibly low barrier to entry. It's not something that you need a referral for. You don't need to have some kind of formal clinical diagnosis. It is there as a service for people who are refugees and asylum seekers to access care and support in the way that they want it. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be sort of particular clinical care. It can be talking to people about life skills, about accessing education, about accessing housing. Also absolutely someone to talk to about your mental health if that's the conversation that you want to have. But we know that things like accessing employment and accessing education and learning about, budgeting and those kinds of, practical skills, if people don't have access to those things, that can really impact their mental health too. And when they're making that big transition to come and live in Australia and it's all sort of new, without access to those practical tips, it can become even more overwhelming. And so that service is very holistic. It provides not just someone to talk to about your mental health perhaps, but also a range of other practical tips and support. So I really encourage people, to make sure that if they are working with communities who are supporting refugees or asylum seekers newly arrived to Australia, that service is an incredibly useful one. And, really for individuals and their whole families, we know that that can be a great way to help them feel settled and positive and happy about their new lives.
Thank you, Minister. We have a question online that I'd like to pose to Dr. Bowden, and the question is from Dinesh Malhotra. Thank you for the question. And the question is that in some communities, among migrants, mental health conditions amongst men are sometimes considered as a weakness perhaps, or not being man enough, or like a stigma in particular amongst men. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts or reflections, Dr. Bowden, on how people might overcome that kind of stigma around mental health in men?
It's such a great question. This isn't confined to migrant communities. This is really, across all cultures, I think. And we come across this quite regularly. It can be very difficult for men, so much of a man's background and socialization can be set up as needing to be in control and needing to be able to provide for your family and so on. And that's quite a lot of pressure. And I think it often does happen that men can feel that mental illness or even just mental distress feels like a weakness to them. I think firstly, it's really important to recognize that if you stress anybody enough, it's actually going to really turn into distress. And stress, as we all know, coming out of the pandemic and all of the other disasters that we've been living through, as the Minister mentioned, that has an impact on absolutely everybody. In fact, I think it's a strength to be able to identify when maybe you're not feeling at the top of your game and to be able to talk to somebody about how that feels. It doesn't mean that you have to feel that you can't do anything simply because you're feeling anxious or depressed or sad or stressed. But it is a sign of stress, I think, to be able to say to people, you know what, I need some help with this. I think people's families can really help as well. Those people who are close to you really care about how you feel and making sure that there is a kind of environment within the family and in your friendship groups of looking out for each other, checking in how you feel, and checking in just how you're going on a day-to-day basis. Just opening up that kind of conversation and really kind of looking for any particular signs that somebody might want to talk about something, and more importantly, giving them the message that it's okay to talk about difficult things. So maybe even just talking about when you're feeling a bit under the weather yourself can open up those conversations too. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do to actually give the message to men that it's okay to talk about feelings, and actually that is a strength.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bowden. Staying with that topic, we've talked a little bit about some of the particular issues around men's mental health, but we know that mental health can affect every part of our community. Do you have any reflections or suggestions for people about recognising signs of mental health, and perhaps suggestions about how to support someone with a mental health condition that might be a young person, for example, a teenager, or maybe an older person? Any thoughts or reflections about that?
Sure. I think, again, kind of setting up that environment of willingness to talk about feelings and emotions is actually really important. It's important for children, but it's important for everybody within our close-knit groups. To just kind of set the scene, really, talk about your own feelings. That gives a very powerful message that you're interested in people's emotional experience, whether it's your children or your friends, elderly people within your family or within your community, kind of reaching out in those kind of ways. But also keeping an eye on how people that you're close to are going. So if people are looking a little downhearted, just check in with them. Hey, how are you going? How are you feeling today? Or, you're not looking like your normal self. Is there something that you're worried about? There's no problem with asking people those kind of things. And the more that we all talk with each other about how we feel, the more there is that kind of permission and normal aspect to talking about things, particularly given that there's so much stress at the moment in people's lives. I think it's great to check in with people. It's also good for us, I think, to reach out to people in our community. It really helps with that kind of community bonding, and to think about the way in which a community can work well together and really look out for each other to create a strong sense of community. That idea of Mental Health Month, which is we've all got a role to play, means that we actually all need to be working together to make sure that things are working well for our communities. If you notice that people are not looking happy, or particularly for children, if they're not interested in doing the kind of things that they usually enjoy doing, maybe they don't want to go to sport practice or music practice, maybe they're not keen on going to school, for example. If there's been a change in how the person is behaving. Actually, if you've already set up that kind of way of talking about emotions, that makes things much easier to talk about. Just ask, how are things going at school? How was your day today at school? How was your day at work today? Or this is what happened to me today, and I felt upset about that, or I felt happy about what happened, and kind of starting that conversation. Another great way of doing it is to actually watch television together with your children, or if they're involved in looking at things on social media, have a conversation with them about that and how they're feeling about what they're watching. And that actually is a great avenue to talk about how they're going in themselves.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Bowden. I think that was really helpful, useful and practical advice. Thank you very much. I'm going to pick up another question that has come up online around the intersectionality of domestic violence and mental health, sadly, is well known. And there's a question around the centre, I think generally services. How do we support people facing violence and linking them up with services? I might ask you to comment, Dr. Bowden, and Minister Jackson, you might want to add some thoughts, but perhaps Dr. Bowden first.
Sure. Look, this is an incredibly serious situation, and it can, it's very widespread, unfortunately, within our communities. I think it's often very hard for people to reach out for assistance when they're in that kind of a situation. But I just want to reassure people that this is not an unusual experience, sadly. And all of our mental health services and all of our healthcare providers actually are very attuned to helping people who are in those kind of situations and very aware of how to provide help. And so there's been a lot of training for our health staff and our mental health staff in looking for signs when that may be happening for people, but also to reach out and seek assistance, whether that's from somebody trusted in your community, and that could be a religious leader or a teacher, it could be your GP, or if you're actually seeing somebody in a other kind of healthcare situation, for your physical healthcare or for your mental health care, being able to talk about what's going on for you in a confidential way, you can be assured that people will know what's available and how to put you in touch with help. It's such an important area that people want to be there to help you with that.
Thank you, Dr. Bowden. Minister Jackson, did you want to add any comment?
Yeah, I think, just on top of what Dr. Bowden said, just to reiterate that all of those conversations can be confidential. And I think that's a really important place to start, that, our health professionals, as he said, are extremely well trained and well attuned to responding to people's, the relationship between people's mental health and their experiences of domestic and family violence. And that they are able to have very confidential conversations that are person-centered on the individual experience that someone is having. So really giving people that confidence when they're interacting with a health professional to talk honestly about what they are experiencing is the first step. The second thing that I would add is everything that we have said about the effort that we make to ensure our health services and our mental health services are culturally appropriate goes for our domestic and family violence services too. So again, there's translated materials, there's interpreters, there's specific multicultural support services for those experiencing domestic and family violence. So there is a range of very, very culturally appropriate and community-led services in the domestic and family violence space as well. And so, if people have that confidence to have those confidential conversations and open up, they should know that there are appropriate community-based services across the spectrum that are available to them. And it's not just the intersectionality between family violence and mental health that it's worth reflecting on here. We know there's intersectionality between experiences of racism and bigotry and mental health as well. And so again, part of this is acknowledging that for our culturally and linguistically diverse communities, who are more likely to experience racism and bigotry, that there are particular, challenges and needs there, and that we recognize that. And it's okay, for people to say, the experiences that I've had are making me feel not very good. They're making me anxious. They're making me sad. And it's about saying to them, it's not your fault. It's not your fault if you've experienced family violence or you've experienced racism and you're feeling bad about that and it's affecting your mental health. That's not on you. We want to wrap services around you, ensure that you're properly supported, and all of those services are available, and they're available in language, and they're available online and through our different transcultural mental health lines as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Minister Jackson. Now, we're almost out of time, but I do have one final question for you, Dr. Bowden, and if you could tell us some things that we can all do day to day that will support our positive mental health. What are some tips that you have around practices every day that we can all undertake to improve our mental health?
Sure. There's so many things that people can do, and they're all just very practical things, which I think make a lot of sense. Making sure that you get enough sleep is really important. Getting regular exercise, eating healthily. There's so much evidence that all of these things are incredibly important, not only for well-being, but also for good mental health. Another thing which has got a lot of scientific evidence behind it, I'm sure people have heard about mindfulness. People talk about it very regularly. There are apps that are available. There's also some great resources that are available in different languages, and we're going to put up a link to some of those in the chat as well. Mindfulness is incredibly important for mental health. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes each day, so it's not a big amount of time to improve your well-being, but it has really positive impacts on people's capacity to feel okay within themselves, to be able to reflect on their experience, and to be able to stay calm in the face of stress and to deal with stress very much more easily. So I'd really encourage people to take a look at some of those resources.
Fabulous. Some great tips. Thank you very much, Dr. Bowden. So that brings us to the end of today's press conference. I really hope that you found a lot of the information that we've talked about useful, and the resources posted online useful to you as well. A big thank you to Minister Jackson for joining us. Much appreciated. Many thanks to you, Dr. Bowden, for being here and sharing all that very useful clinical advice for all of us. And I hope that you've got some good tips today around the role that you can play, that your family, the communities can play to improve mental health this Mental Health Month. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.